Welcome back, everyone. Well, some of the most popular content on this channel tends to be the stuff I do surrounding the U.S. presidents. For whatever reason, and myself included in this, we find them interesting. We find their stories interesting. We find talking about them to be interesting. And one of the most popular things that I've done lately was my tier ranking of U.S. presidents, both the one I did solo and then, of course, the 4-hour live stream I did with Mr. Beat. Also very popular on this channel, of course, are the reaction videos. So I'm going to combine those elements today. And I'm going to do something that I probably a few months ago wouldn't have touched, but I'm feeling a little frisky these days. So we're going to take a look at Ben Shapiro and his ranking of the U.S. presidents, the tier rankings. And I'm just going to make some observations and tell you what I agree with, what I disagree with. Listen, it's no secret. I make no secret of the fact that I am politically conservative. And I know that he is too. I don't always agree with everything he says or with anybody. Listen, never make the mistake of pigeonholing someone into a category because they lean one direction. Not every conservative voted for or supports Donald Trump. Not every liberal voted for or supports Joe Biden or voted for or supported Barack Obama. People are complicated. People have many layers to them. And, when you start making assumptions about a person, that's a mistake, I think. But by and large, I probably would, at least in my assumptions, think that I'll agree with a lot of his picks, but I'll be curious to see what we have to say here. So let's dive in and take a look at Ben Shapiro's president's tier ranking.
In American history. Before we jump in, this video is sponsored by Ring. On this tier list, we have 5 tiers. We have S, which I suppose stands for superior since it's at the top of the list, and then we have A, B, C, and F.
No
now,
D?
I'm really missing the letter D here, I will admit to you, because there are a bunch of presidents here who I think are actually D, but because they are D, I'm going to put them in the F category. We'll get to those in a moment.
That's kind of an interesting decision. Or I don't know if he doesn't know how to add D or if he removed it on purpose or what, but I don't know. I feel like F should be reserved for like the worst of the worst. The Woodrow Wilsons and the Andrew Johnsons and the James Buchanans of the world. There are some that are D that weren't awful, weren't complete disasters, that just were maybe very ineffective. I disagree.
A moment. So let's start with the presidents who are at the very tip top of the list, the best presidents in the history of the United States.
So
Obviously,
interesting. He's going to just kind of rank them, go with all the ones he thinks. That's an interesting way to do it.
on the top of the list, George Washington, our first president, kept
Agree.
the country together, left office peacefully. The father of the country, a great man, easy pick, right? George Washington as number one. And
Agree.
then everybody knows that the other president, there are only 2 presidents in this top tier. There are not 3. Okay, I know the left thinks FDR is in that
say
top
Lincoln.
tier. I know some people on the right think that Reagan's in that top tier. Neither one of them are Washington or Lincoln. Lincoln is the other guy in that top tier, beyond simply leading America through the Civil War and to a new birth of freedom. It was Lincoln who, as a thinker, helped to revivify the idea that the Declaration of Independence was an inherent part of the Constitution of the United States, that the two were inseparable. The ideas of liberty were not restricted to the Declaration of Independence as a non-operable piece of legislation. But
I get what he's saying, and can't disagree with any of that. Listen, everything that happens through the first 15 presidents of the United States, every one of them had to deal with the slavery issue. Lincoln ended that. Of course, after Lincoln, everybody has to deal with the civil rights issue that comes out of slavery. So that problem was still there. It just changed form, I guess you could say. But I don't disagree with either of those picks.
it actually infused the Constitution of the United States, and that liberty principles were supposed to be extended
It's interesting he's taking this long to talk about Lincoln, which means there's going to be a lot of people he doesn't spend a lot of time on.
to all people of the United States, not merely white Americans. So for that reason, Abraham Lincoln is top of the heap along with George Washington. So that's the easy part, right? That's what everybody does. Washington and Lincoln are the 2 best presidents. There's very little debate about this. Then things start to get kind of interesting. So I'm going to sort of do this in reverse order. I'm going to start with the people who I think are just the worst presidents.
Wilson,
people who just were
Johnson.
terrible. So let's begin with the president who I think was pretty easily the worst president of the United States,
Yes.
without much of a question.
My man.
Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a
Okay, so far I'm liking his tier list. I'm sure there are going to be some things I disagree with, but y'all know how much I hate Woodrow Wilson.
clear F. Woodrow Wilson is a garbaggio. Woodrow Wilson was a vicious racist
Yep.
who was in favor of radical expansion of the federal government. He believed that the state should have no limits on it. He was effectively a socialist. He believed that the administrative government of the United States should be run top-down by the elites. He not only got us into World War I, he then used World War I as a pretext to basically go after his political opponents with the Sedition Act. Woodrow Wilson was a
True, and that was something that he had in common with John Adams, the whole Sedition Act, and which was still on the books, by the way, the Alien and Sedition Act. Some of them had been repealed, but some of that was still on the books going all the way back to Adams' administration. Now, I understand that he's going to come at this from his political philosophy. I tried to keep my political philosophy out of it because I recognize that though I'm conservative, there are times that very liberal presidents have been great presidents. And not only great presidents, but great for the country. I don't know if he's able to separate those two, and that's fine. That's how he's coming at this. I just approached it in a different way, but it seems pretty clear that his hate for Wilson, my hate for Wilson is much more about his character. His hate for Wilson is much more about his policies.
Horrible, horrible, horrible president. And the fact that for a long time he was considered one of our better presidents
still is.
Speaks to how dumb America's historical class is.
Let's talk about this because he still is considered one of the best by a lot of people. Now, it's fair to say that as time goes on, Woodrow Wilson is dropping down the list. I chose to look just at C-SPAN historian survey results because there are a lot of different surveys that have been done with different groups of people. This way, we're looking at just what historians have to say, which obviously historians have a particular slant too. But right here, you have Abraham Lincoln, number one in the surveys that were done in 2000, 2009, 2017, 2021. George Washington, consistently 2. Franklin Roosevelt, consistently the last 3. He's been 3. Theodore Roosevelt, 4. Eisenhower has been climbing the ranks, 9, 8, 5, and 5. Truman stays right around 5 or 6. Boy, we had a great run of presidents there, didn't we? Think about that. Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy, all in the top 8 and right in a row, those 4 presidents. Boy, it was a good run. But right here is Woodrow Wilson. Consistently, he was as high as 6th in 2000. Dropped to 9th in 2009, 11th, and now 13th. And I have a feeling he's going to continue to go down that list as society changes, as our view of things change a little bit.
The reason a lot of America's historical class likes him is because they, again, like the administrative state. The administrative state, for those who don't know, that's the idea the executive branch really should run the government, that the legislature is sort of a vestigial organ. The president should be, as Woodrow Wilson says, as big a man as he can be. As big a man as is capable of filling the office.
And honestly, that's a continuation of Theodore Roosevelt's idea of the bully pulpit and using the presidency to impose your will. So not really all that different than thinking of the time from other people.
Big fan of how German government was run. He was a big fan of the idea that the government was sort of the be-all, end-all. Was Woodrow Wilson. Awful, awful person, awful president. He is definitely in the F category. Other presidents are in the F category. So this is where I really wish that there was like a D category right here.
So he must have picked a tier list that didn't have a D and doesn't know how to add one, but that's okay.
What would be the D category, but we're going to have to push him into the F category because we really have no other choice. There is no D category here. LBJ definitely goes in that category. In that
well, and again, he's going to be coming at this from his extreme conservative viewpoint, and LBJ, if you are basing this on a conservative ideology, that makes sense.
Category. So
I disagree.
LBJ, awful president. The sole bright spot in the LBJ administration was a bright spot, and that was the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, which is exactly right on banning all sorts of...
But honestly, I mean, you got to give him credit for that, and I think that in and of itself is enough to raise him out of F or D for me, because this was a Southern Democrat at a time when Southern Democrats were opposed to civil rights. And he had opposed that himself as a congressman and as a senator, but then he becomes president and he does the right thing. Whatever the man's character was, he did the right thing at a time when a lot of Southern Democrats weren't doing the right thing.
State practices of discrimination is wrong when it comes to encroaching into private rights of association, and is wrong in some of its broad outlines as far as how to deal with the private sector. Everything else is garbage. The extension of the welfare state is garbage. The Vietnam War and his strategy in pursuing the Vietnam War,
with that.
Graduated equilibrium, horrible, horrible garbage. Right? So LBJ, terrible president, he definitely goes in that bottom tier along with Woodrow Wilson. Other people who belong in that bottom tier, and the much beloved FDR goes in that bottom tier.
And again, this is going to be him coming from this in terms of his conservative leanings, and I disagree strongly with this one too. I don't like all of FDR's policies personally, but I see how at the time, given the situation with the Great Depression, how some of those were very helpful to the country and helped pick people up who were in very difficult situations. And his leadership in World War II was fantastic, other than the internment camps of Japanese Americans, which I think we can all agree was abhorrent. But I'd never put him in F. There's too much good that outweighs the bad. Again, I'm looking at this from, was he good for the country, not do I agree with everything he did.
Despite historians' attempts to paint FDR as a wonderful president, it's pretty obvious that he lengthened the Great Depression by as much as 8 years, according to a study from UCLA Anderson Business School, through his horrific economic policies. He basically portrayed anybody who was not under his thumb as a quote-unquote malefactor of great wealth. He was a class warrior in the extreme.
Which is kind of interesting because FDR came from a background of wealth and privilege.
He really didn't know much about economic policy. Like, I'm glad that he was great on the radio, but aside from his pursuit of World War II, that's pretty much it. Now, this is
I feel like, and I've said this several times already, I feel like he's so adamant about the conservative principles here that he brushes aside anything that was actually good. Like, and he said basically, other than, but then he mentioned something really, really big, like, other than, his leadership in World War II, he wasn't that great. Or other than the Civil Rights Act of 1965, LBJ wasn't that great. These are big, big deals. You can't just other than things like that.
Again, that D category would have been good because FDR as a World War II leader was good, except for, the whole unfortunate imprisoning 100,000 Japanese Americans in camps. That was not so good. But other than that,
not so good. That's an understatement.
I wish that he were in that D category, just like I wish that LBJ were in that D category, so we could at least recognize the good things they did alongside all the bad things. But some people have FDR in like the top tier of presidents. No effing way. No way. Okay, other presidents who belong in that bottom tier of presidents. I'm put Richard Nixon in that bottom tier of presidents. I think Nixon was a terrible president. I know there are a lot of Republicans.
Now, again, Nixon probably on the more liberal side of Republicanism back when Republicans still had, at that time, each party had a conservative and a more liberal wing to it. And actually, for most of history, it's been that way. It's only been in the last few decades that the parties have become more extreme and haven't had as much wiggle room. There's a little bit. But when you do have somebody who, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, for example, who's a Democrat that's more conservative, or a Sue Collins, who's a Republican who's a little more liberal from the Northeast, they get painted as this like terrible betrayer of their party, when for most of history the party had room for those sides of things. And yeah, Nixon was probably on the more liberal end of the Republican Party at the time, but so were a lot of Republican presidents.
I have sort of a warm spot for Nixon, mainly because he was not George McGovern. But putting aside Watergate, which again is like the least of his sins, considering that LBJ bugged Barry Goldwater's headquarters in 1964. He instituted price and wage controls. He did not dismantle the vast government apparatus that was built by LBJ. In fact, he exacerbated that. He pursued the opening of China, which has resulted in the rise of a dictatorial empire that now threatens American power in Southeast Asia. So not a big Nixon fan. I know there are a lot of people who are. I'm not. You could plausibly put him in the C category, but
yeah, I'd probably put him
F,
closer there.
And finally, as the last person who goes in that F category, there are two more for the F category.
Johnson.
One is going to be Barack Obama. So Obama goes in the F category. I think it was an awful.
This goes without saying. I mean, this is all about his political leanings. There's no way Barack Obama goes in the same tier with Woodrow Wilson. And I can't believe he hasn't thrown James Buchanan and Andrew Johnson in this tier.
President, I think he did horrific work, mainly with regard to his rhetoric. In terms of his legislation, I think Obamacare was an atrocity, and I think that his spending plans with stimulus and raising us to $4 trillion budgets, it's helped destroy the economic future of the United States. That's bad enough. But between 2008 and 2012, Barack Obama morphed from a president who sort of campaigned on almost a Clintonian third way as a guy who wasn't for red states and not blue states, but the United States. And in 2012, he went just hardcore intersectionality. Anybody who opposes me is a racist. America can be divvied into various victimized groups that can be cobbled together in a new rising ascendant majority.
I don't know how much of the whole anybody who opposes me is racist thing you put on Obama, though. I mean, there were a lot of people who were saying that, but I don't remember him being the one saying that.
Against the old America is extremely damaging, and I think that is going to be the future of American politics for quite a while. I think the Democratic Party never quite got over the Obama coalition of 2012. They've been trying to pursue it ever since, and it has broken American politics in ways large and small. So Obama goes in that bottom category. And then finally, last guy who goes in that category is, of course, James Buchanan.
Seriously, where is Andrew Johnson? I don't even see Andrew Johnson on this list. Like, unless there's more down below, it seems like he skipped a lot of presidents.
Who was the president just before the Civil War. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure the Civil War happens because of James Buchanan. I don't think he does much to stop it.
It was going to happen anyway.
You have a bunch of events.
Buchanan just didn't do anything to stave it off. He just didn't do anything, really. I think it was inevitable at that point, so I'm not sure anybody would have done better in that situation. But
that are happening outside of Buchanan's control. Doesn't mean he was a good president. He was a terrible president. Okay, so now we've got your top category. We've got the F category. Now we're going to do some people who are in the middle. So in the A category, which is just below S, we'll put Calvin Coolidge. So Calvin Coolidge, really underrated president. Because Calvin Coolidge is the last president in American history to truly understand that the presidency should not be a major factor in your life. Now, Calvin Coolidge was famously taciturn. They used to call him Silent Cal. There's a famous story about Calvin Coolidge where he was at some sort of dinner party and a reporter came up to him and she said to him, President Coolidge, I've just made a bet with somebody. And she said, my bet is that I can make you say more than 2 words.
You lose.
Said, you lose. And that was sort of how Coolidge...
I don't know if that's true. That's one of those stories like William Howard Taft getting caught in the bathtub that probably aren't true, but were used to make a point about someone. But I agree. Calvin Coolidge was probably the last president who did not really use the executive to force things to happen. He was probably the last of people who had the philosophy that the executive was just there to facilitate things and not to change things or to force things to happen.
Coolidge was, but Coolidge also had a wonderful understanding of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. He gave a speech on July 4th, and it's one of the great orations in American history about what America means and why the foundational principles of the Declaration of Independence had led to the prosperity of the United States, how the freedoms and liberties guaranteed to individuals had led to the prosperity of the United States, that we were created by the Declaration, we were created by the Constitution, we do not get to create it. It's really, really good stuff. One of the tragedies of American history is that Coolidge stepped down and Herbert Hoover took over, and Herbert Hoover was, in fact, quite a bad president.
Yeah.
Who else do we have here? Well, I'll put Reagan in that A category. And now, Reagan's big problem as a president was, of course, that he didn't get the spending under control. He was also saddled with the Democratic Senate for part of his term. In terms of breaking the back of inflation in the United States through his Fed chief, Paul Volcker, in terms of radically lowering taxes in the United States and leading to 2 decades of growth, in terms of escalating defense spending, particularly on Star Wars, and breaking the power of the Soviet Union, Ronald Reagan goes near the top of the...
Yeah, and again, coming from Ben Shapiro's philosophy on things, honestly surprised he didn't make him an S, but not surprised by A.
So he ends up with Calvin Coolidge, who was one of his heroes, by the way, in that A category. Other presidents who end up in that A category, probably have to put Thomas Jefferson in the A category for his Federalist view of American government, what we would call Federalist now, meaning he wanted to devolve more powers to the states. Also, the Louisiana Purchase, which is one of those weird...
Yeah, I was going to say, he was not a Federalist. The Federalists were the ones who were for the strong central government. He was what was first known as anti-Federalist and then later known as Democratic Republicans. The Federalists were the Alexander Hamiltons of the world. And the Federalist Party pretty much died out after John Adams, who was the last Federalist president. Democratic Republicans pretty much ran the show until, for a while, you had the Whigs and then later the Republicans.
Weird moments in American history where he saw a good deal, recognized he didn't have the constitutional authority to make it, and then went ahead and made it anyway. But Jefferson is widely regarded as one of our better presidents.
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely true, and I've talked about this before. Thomas Jefferson's such a weird guy when it comes to his principles, because he had very strong principles, and yet when he became president, had no problem breaking those principles if he thought it was something that was best for the country. And you know, some could argue that that's a good thing, that someone recognizes that even though they have principles, sometimes they need to do that. Other people might criticize a decision like that. But, he's a guy who's against America having a standing army, but he is the one who supervises the establishment of West Point as our military academy to train officers for our standing army. He's all about the federal government having as little authority and power as possible, and yet he supervises the purchase of Louisiana Purchase, which doubles the size of the United States territory. Pretty interesting stuff. But I agree with that ranking.
I'll put Ulysses S. Grant, I think, in this category. So there's been a
wouldn't
great
argue with
revision
that.
about how Ulysses S. Grant is portrayed in American history. Ulysses S. Grant originally was portrayed as sort of a drunken sot who lucked his way through the Civil War and then into the presidency, and then was responsible for the rise of pork politics and sort of Gilded Era corruption. That's not really accurate. If you're going to remember Ulysses S. Grant's presidency for anything, remember it for the fact that he presided over Reconstruction. And one of the great tragedies of American history is that Reconstruction ends with Ulysses S. Grant's term in office.
And I will say this about the whole Reconstruction thing. American public approval of Reconstruction, public support, was gone by the end of Grant's administration. So no matter who came next, Reconstruction was done. So a lot of people blame Rutherford B. Hayes coming in 1877 and Rutherford making his deal to pull the federal troops out and end Reconstruction as part of his deal to get the votes to become president. It didn't matter. Whoever got elected, if Samuel Tilden had been elected, the same thing would have happened. So unfortunately, and Grant hated the fact that was true. He found himself in a position where it was harder and harder and harder to justify the use of federal authority in the South because people in the North were just tired of it. And that's unfortunate because there was so much more work that needed done.
And Jim Crow really begins and gains a serious hold, and the KKK basically becomes a powerful force in the South after Ulysses S. Grant leaves office. Revisionist historians are now kind of looking back on the Grant era and realizing that he was a stalwart defender of freedoms being extended to newly freed slaves in the South. B presidents, so people who are like, okay, kind of okay. So I'll put JFK in, I'm putting him as a C. JFK goes as a C. One of the more overrated presidents in American history. Obviously, history has been more kind to JFK because of the assassination than
And I agree with that, and I've said that before. I think I'd probably put him higher than that, at least at a B, just because his leadership, I think, in the Cuban Missile Crisis was fantastic and one of the best moments in presidential history. That 13 days during that crisis is one of the best 2 weeks of any presidency I think there's ever been. He just handled that, I think, flawlessly, that particular crisis. There's a lot of things you could say about him negatively, character-wise and otherwise, but I do think that we tend to overinflate his importance and how good he was because of how he died and because of the whole Camelot ethos, as they call it Camelot, this ethos of the young guy and his pretty wife, and how it was shattered and destroyed, and he was, I think we do that with a lot of public figures.
It otherwise would have been. The man was responsible for a wide variety of debacles during his first couple of years in office, including the Bay of Pigs debacle. However, he was a fervent anti-communist who did cut taxes. But as far as him being like one of our better presidents, I don't see any evidence of that. By the way, our engagement in Vietnam begins with JFK. It does not begin with LBJ. Let's see, Grover Cleveland we'll put in the B category. So Grover Cleveland, the only president to serve twice non-consecutively. Grover Cleveland was responsible for making sure that the federal government did not outgrow what it was supposed to be. He famously rejected a stimulus package directed at Texas drought relief, saying that there is no constitutional warrant for this.
And Grover Cleveland, I believe, I want to take a look at this list, but I believe had more vetoes in his first term than any other president in history. In fact, let's take a look at that. Okay, so here are the list of vetoes by president. And you can see here that Grover Cleveland, in his first term in 4 years, 304 regular vetoes, as well as 110 pocket vetoes. The pocket veto, basically in simple terms, the way it works normally in our government system is that when Congress passes a bill, it goes to the president. The president can either veto it, which means it does not become law unless Congress votes to override the veto, which requires two-thirds majority to do that. But he can sign it and it becomes law, or he can fail to sign it, just do nothing, and after 10 days it becomes law, except in the case of pocket vetoes, where if Congress passes a law and then they're no longer in session, then it's called a pocket veto, because it means the president doesn't sign it and it basically fails to become law because Congress isn't in session to be able to enact it. It's just kind of a weird quirk of our system, and it was something that Roosevelt used a lot. In 12 years, he had 635 total vetoes. But in 4 years, Grover Cleveland had 414 vetoes in his first term. By far the most. The only person who even comes close to that, actually really nobody comes close to that in 4 years. You can see in modern presidencies, Trump had 10 vetoes, Obama 12, George W. Bush 12, and of course, you can look at how many times they were overridden. Grover Cleveland was overridden only twice out of those 414 vetoes. The only person who got overridden a lot was Gerald Ford 12 times and Harry Truman 12 times. Ford, that happened in, 2.5 years. So, that tells you a little bit more about those presidencies.
Which is something you would never hear from a president today. He goes in the B category. I'll put William Howard Taft in the same category. William Howard Taft was a far more conservative figure than Teddy Roosevelt. We'll get to Teddy in just one second. Yep. William Howard Taft was a sort of retrenchment of traditional Republican values. He went on to serve on the Supreme Court of the United States. It's sort of a figure that's been lost to history, and people make jokes about him because he was extremely fat. But
yeah, probably one of the better Ohio presidents. We've got 8 that we claim, 7 that were born here, and then William Henry Harrison, who got elected from Ohio, even though he was born in Virginia. But most of our presidents weren't necessarily all that standout. We've had a few decent ones, Grant being one of them. But Taft, he goes more conservative than his predecessor, the man who handpicked him to be his successor, Theodore Roosevelt, who was a more progressive, more on that kind of liberal wing of the Republican Party at the time. Taft got kind of swings back more moderate, more to a little bit to the conservative side, but still keeps some of Taft's policies going, like going after the trusts and things like that.
But the truth is that he was actually a pretty good president, and if it had not been for Teddy Roosevelt and his ego trips, then William Howard Taft would be more fondly remembered as the person who defeated Woodrow Wilson in 1916.
And that's absolutely 100% true, because if Theodore Roosevelt had not decided, and it's fair to argue it's an ego trip at that point, Roosevelt basically told the Republican Party, if you don't nominate me over Taft was the sitting president at the time, and Roosevelt runs against him. He said, if you don't nominate me, I will run third party, and Wilson will win the election. And that's exactly what happened. Theodore Roosevelt is responsible for us getting Woodrow Wilson. So it's tough to overlook that. And listen, I love Theodore Roosevelt. He's probably my favorite president, but it frustrates me to no end that he did that. That's just a reality.
Which in 1912, which would have changed the course of American history for the better in a lot of ways. Harry Truman is a B president. He tends toward the C.
I might go A.
He's a B president because of his Cold Warrior nature. Because of his handling of the end of World War II. I have a personal fondness as a Jew for Harry Truman, as virtually all American Jews do, because of his willingness to signal American support for the establishment of the State of Israel. The reason he doesn't rank higher on the list is because he had some dictatorial tendencies with regard to unions. There's a famous Steele case in which he intervened in a fairly illegal way. And then not only that, his policy toward China was really bad. He should have provided significantly more support to Shanghai Shek in the face of the Maoist revolution in China. His failure to do so was instrumental in the rise of communist China. Also, his handling of the Korean War left some things to be desired. President Trump, I think, is...
I don't think I can strongly disagree with too much of that with Truman, though I do have Truman as an A. I think I'd probably put more emphasis on other areas of his presidency than Ben does, but that's okay.
A B president. Now, I think in terms of policy, he'd be closer to an A, I think in rhetoric, the problem is that he's really been self-defeating, the president. I think most people understand this. So he's had some real rhetorical highs. I mean, he gave a great speech in Mount Rushmore, for example, that I talked extensively about. He gave an excellent speech in Poland talking about the defense of Western civilization. He has said many great things in the culture war that I think are worthy of saying. He has also said some incredibly wild and irresponsible things over the course of his presidency.
Yeah, I try to avoid modern stuff too much, but I will say this. I think Donald Trump was his own worst enemy. I think he probably would have gotten reelected had he not gotten in his own way. That's all I'll say about it.
See, he has led to less support for his agenda items that should be wildly more popular. I mean, the fact
He's
is
not
that
wrong.
Heading into the election, over 55% of Americans said that they were better off than they were 4 years ago, and then he performed at like 46% of the...
And normally, if you're getting those kinds of numbers, you should get reelected. But
popular vote. There's only one reason for that, and that's because he was so rhetorically irresponsible. Again, on policy,
he's right.
You got to put Trump up with people like Ronald Reagan and Calvin Coolidge. In terms of rhetoric, you got to put him much further down the list, and so he ends up on average being in that B category. He is not an F, as so many people keep saying. That's ridiculous. He is not even close to in the same category as people like Woodrow Wilson,
I agree.
for example.
I agree with that.
One F,
I wouldn't put him
Jimmy.
at a B, but I agree that he is nowhere near the Woodrow Wilsons and James Buchanans of the world.
Jimmy Carter was an F. Jimmy Carter was a garbage president. So, as always, like all historians, I forget Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was not a good president. Maybe slightly better than people recall, in the sense that he actually did try to bring down inflation in the latter years of his administration.
I think time will be kinder to Jimmy Carter. I mean, it's been some time. He was president when I was born, so it's been a while now. But I think, like how we see Woodrow Wilson 100 years later starting to be thought less of, I think Jimmy Carter will probably be seen in a more favorable light as time goes by. We'll see.
So, unsuccessfully, but slightly better does not mean good. He was still a horrible, horrible president, so horrible that he got himself blown out by Ronald Reagan, who was largely considered by the media to be this sort of jokey figure. Okay, C presidents. So I'm going to put Teddy Roosevelt in the C category. Again, were there a D category, he would be in the D category.
That's interesting. And again, I know this is Ben Shapiro's conservatism coming out. And like I said, I'm conservative too, but I'm trying to see this through the light of, was he good for the country? And he absolutely was. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, I think, was one of the best for the country that we've ever had. You might disagree with him on policy, but you can't disagree with the results.
Teddy Roosevelt was the first progressive president. He foreshadowed Woodrow Wilson, believed in the rise of the administrative state and this massive federal infrastructure. He pursued trust busting, which was really an irresponsible policy driven by populist need to break up big companies for no actual legal reason.
I will say this about the trust busting. It didn't really have the effect. And I agree. It was kind of a populist thing that people wanted to bring down the big companies because they started seeing these billionaires and these multi hundreds of millions of dollars being acquired by people. And that had never really happened before on that scale. So people were like, what the heck? What's going on? And they saw how many people were living very poorly. But the trust busting didn't necessarily fix that because, for one thing, guys like Rockefeller, it made him richer when they broke up his company. So it didn't always have the effect. But there was an issue with competition and stuff like that, and we've talked about that. But listen, some of the stuff he did, that he used the federal government for, it's hard to argue against. The Food and Drug Administration, just basic health and safety type things, and national parks and conservation. I think everybody agrees those are good things, and I don't know.
I don't think that Teddy was a particularly good president. He did have expansionist tendencies that definitely maximized the territorial holdings of the United States, or at least protectorates of the United States.
But here's what I'll say about that, and a little bit of, I think, some hypocrisy on Ben's part. He rated Thomas Jefferson as an A, who doubled the size of the country by purchasing land from Napoleon. And then he's going to criticize the expansionist tendencies of Theodore Roosevelt, who, during his presidency, what did we really add? Panama? And that we don't even have anymore. It was just a temporary thing. The Philippines, we were already kind of moving on by the time Roosevelt takes office. I don't know.
But overall, not a big Teddy Roosevelt fan. James K. Polk is an oft-neglected figure. He was responsible for widening the borders of the United States into Oregon and the beginnings of places like California in recognizing the Texas Republic, the Mexican-American War. He probably goes in the B category. Also, the only...
So again, talking about expansionists, the two presidents who added the most territory to the United States are Polk and Jefferson, A and B. But he criticized Roosevelt and said he should have been a D and mentioned that as one of the same things. I don't know. Seems a little fishy to me.
The president in American history to run for one term and then win and pledge at the beginning, I'm only going to be a one-term president and then leave. Which, honestly, that'd be... More of that would be good. Calvin Coolidge ended up doing that, but I don't think he pledged to do that at the very beginning. Dwight Eisenhower, a lot of people would put him in like the A category. I would even put him as a C. I'm not a big fan of Dwight Eisenhower's foreign policy. I think that Dwight Eisenhower's foreign policy, which was supposedly realist, actually, in many ways, effectuated many of the problems that we see today in places like the Middle East. He supported the wrong side in the Suez Canal crisis. He basically did nothing as the Russians steamrolled the Hungarians during the Hungarian Revolution.
Yeah, but what was he going to do at that point? I mean, I'm not sure what Eisenhower could have done that might have changed what was happening in Eastern Europe or in the Middle East at that time. Eisenhower, again, one of those ones that's consistently rated high. I gave him an A.
In 56. Yeah, I'm actually not a huge Dwight Eisenhower.
I feel like this is really kind of wishful thinking. Like, I wish that he had done this, when in practicality, as he said himself, realist would say, really, what else was he going to do?
Overrated. And then finally, in C presidents, I'm going to put George W. Bush as a C-level president. And that's largely because of the last 3 years of his administration. Mm-hmm. He started off as a sort of compromise figure, and then he became the guy who led us through 9/11 in what I think was truly heroic fashion. Yeah. And then by the end of his term, when he was...
And I think everybody agrees with that. His approval rating was like 90% in the aftermath of 9/11. I think both sides supported his leadership during that time, time when we needed people to get behind their leader. And yeah, I mean, Katrina comes along, and a lot of the stuff that happens the last couple of years was not good. The recession, and unfortunately, a lot of his presidency is going to be judged by those things.
Saying that we had to step in and save capitalism by destroying capitalism, and when he was not taking on the subprime mortgage crisis, I think, in a responsible way. The big problem for Bush is that Bush was never capable of explaining himself and sort of assumed that history would explain him for him. And I just don't think that's ever a good strategy. Okay, so there you have 20.
All right, so that's interesting. And of course, he didn't rank a lot of the presidents. He only ranked certain ones, and seems like he ranked a lot of Republicans. I mean, how many Democrats do we have here? We've got Grover Cleveland and Harry Truman and Polk. So 3 Democrats at B. I mean, I guess Jefferson's a Democratic Republican, but that's before the modern Democrat Party. JFK is a Democrat, and then you got Woodrow Wilson, LBJ, FDR, Obama, Buchanan, and Carter, all Democrats. So about what I would have expected from Ben Shapiro, but let me know your thoughts about that. Let's try to keep it civil, guys. I'm venturing into uneasy territory by even reacting to this in the first place, but let's please keep it civil, keep it on discussion. By the time you guys see this, I'm going to be on a cruise with my wife, so I probably won't be responding to comments in real time very much, but your comments are certainly welcome below. Thanks for watching.